skies over the Middle East in late February 2026 no longer carry the blue of hope, but are instead stained deep crimson by the fires of war and the lethal streaks of cruise missiles. The world watches with bated breath as a confrontation unfolds that many fear marks the true beginning of a third world war. Operations Epic Fury and Lion's Roar have been officially activated, signaling a brutal turning point in modern geopolitical history. 200 sophisticated fighter jets from Israel and the United States have launched a simultaneous strike, pounding over 500 high-value targets across Iranian territory. This is no longer a shadow war or a series of proxy skirmishes. It is a direct, decapitating assault on the heart of a sovereign power. Initial reports from the ground indicate that Tehran is trembling under waves of catastrophic bombardment, with missiles slamming into government buildings and top-secret military installations. Amidst this unprecedented chaos, a piece of news has broken that has sent shockwaves across every capital on the planet. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with 40 high-ranking commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has been neutralized. The strike was a display of terrifying precision, targeting a fortified complex on Pasteur Street. Satellite imagery reveals total devastation at the site, with thick black smoke billowing over a vast area of the capital. President Donald Trump quickly confirmed the event on social media, framing it as a moment of justice for the victims of the Tehran regime spanning 4 decades. However, beneath the triumphalism of his supporters, a much harsher reality is surfacing. Iran did not collapse like a house of cards, as some strategists predicted, drawing flawed parallels to the political instability seen in Venezuela years prior. Instead, the nation has activated the Mosaic defense system, a strategy of decentralized authority and large-scale guerrilla warfare that makes any hope for a swift Western victory seem like a dangerous fantasy. While the fires of war consume Tehran, a different kind of storm is quietly brewing within the Oval Office. Internal sources suggest that the White House is in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. This fear stems not only from Iran's brutal retaliation against American bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, but also from a critical health emergency involving the president himself. Days without sleep spent monitoring the campaign, the crushing weight of reports detailing American casualties, including at least 6 soldiers killed in the opening hours and fierce opposition from a divided Congress, have pushed the leader of the free world into a state of severe exhaustion. A high-level health alert has been issued, creating a perilous power vacuum at the exact moment the world needs steady leadership. Top advisors are locked in heated arguments over a potential exit strategy, but the grim truth is that they have opened a door to a conflict with no clear way out. The situation is further exacerbated as global oil prices have surged to over $150 per barrel following the complete blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Major economies from Europe to Asia are facing the imminent collapse of their energy supply chains. Iran, in its desperation and fury, has declared that it has nothing left to lose and will utilize weapons never before revealed to incinerate the entire region. Luxury hotels in Dubai and commercial hubs in Doha have become targets for kamikaze drones, shattering the illusion of a safe and prosperous Persian Gulf. Now, the question is no longer who will win this war, but whether global civilization can survive the free fall of the current international order. The panic in Washington is more than just a political crisis. It is the sound of a system losing control in the eye of a relentless storm of retaliation. The silence that descended upon the Situation Room following the confirmation of the Supreme Leader's death was not one of peace, but of a suffocating, atmospheric dread. As the high-definition screens displayed the smoldering ruins of the Pasteur Street complex, the initial cheers of a few aides were quickly silenced by the grim reality manifesting on the secondary monitors. Radar tracks showed dozens, then hundreds of signatures rising from silos across the Iranian plateau. The retaliation was not a slow build, it was an instantaneous, scorched earth response. Yet, it was at this exact moment, with the world on the brink of total escalation, that the unthinkable occurred within the inner sanctum of American power. President Donald Trump, who had been the face of this aggressive posture, suddenly appeared physically compromised. Witnesses within the room describe a moment of profound disorientation, a sudden pallor that washed over the commander-in-chief as he attempted to process the sheer scale of the incoming fire. The health alert, initially whispered among the medical staff, soon became a full-blown emergency that sent the Secret Service into a frenzy of activity. This was the fatal crash that no war game had predicted, a leadership crisis occurring simultaneously with a massive military strike. The White House medical unit was seen rushing equipment into the residential quarters, while the vice president was discreetly moved to a secure, undisclosed location. The panic was not merely about a medical condition. It was about the loss of the singular voice that had driven this entire campaign. Without the president's direct authorization, the chain of command began to experience a friction that threatened to paralyze the American response. Military commanders at Central Command were left waiting for orders that were being delayed by the internal chaos in Washington. Iran, sensing this momentary hesitation, doubled down on its aggression. Their ballistic missiles, including the advanced Fata and Khorramshahr models, were not just aimed at military outposts, but were directed toward the critical infrastructure that sustains the global economy. In the corridors of the West Wing, the atmosphere shifted from strategic deliberation to raw, unadulterated survival. Aides were seen frantically making phone calls, their voices hushed but filled with an unmistakable tremor. The narrative of a clean, decisive victory had evaporated within minutes, replaced by the terrifying prospect of a leaderless superpower facing an enraged adversary. The panic was further fueled by reports of cyberattacks targeting the American power grid and financial systems, a digital second front that Iran had coordinated to hit precisely when the administration was most vulnerable. The markets, already reeling from the oil price spike, began a free fall that saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average drop 3,000 points in a single session. This was no longer just a Middle Eastern conflict. It was a systemic collapse that was beginning to ripple through every layer of American society. The health of the president became the ultimate wild card in a deck already stacked with high-stakes risks. Rumors began to circulate on social media, amplified by foreign intelligence services, suggesting that the president had suffered a major stroke or a cardiac event. While the White House press secretary attempted to issue a statement regarding extreme fatigue and a minor respiratory issue, the lack of visual proof of the president's well-being only served to heighten the sense of national insecurity. The contrast was jarring. While the Iranian military was releasing high-energy videos of their missile launches, the American people were met with a wall of secrecy and confusion from their own government. This discrepancy in communication allowed the Iranian propaganda machine to claim that the regime was being struck down by divine intervention, further emboldening their proxies in Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen to launch their own offensives. By the time the sun began to rise over Washington, the full scope of the disaster was becoming clear. The White House was not just managing a war, it was managing a total institutional crisis. The panic had moved beyond the staff and into the very fabric of the government. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle were demanding transparency, some even raising the prospect of the 25th Amendment if the president was indeed incapacitated. In the midst of this political firestorm, the Iranian retaliation continued unabated, with reports of American casualties rising as the first light touched the wreckage of bases in the Persian Gulf. The world was witnessing the beginning of a new, darker chapter, where the health of one man and the stability of a nation were being tested as never before. The crash was not just physical or medical, it was the total breakdown of a strategy that had failed to account for the human cost of global dominance. As the morning sun struggled to pierce through the heavy smog of uncertainty hanging over Washington, the internal crisis within the White House reached a fever pitch. The term fatal crash began to circulate in the corridors of power, no longer just a metaphor for the potential collapse of the military campaign, but a literal description of the total systemic failure occurring at the highest levels of government. Intelligence reports, which had once promised a swift and decisive victory, were now being shredded by the reality of a multi-front war that the United States was ill-prepared to manage without a functioning commander-in-chief. The decapitation of the Iranian leadership, which was supposed to trigger a popular uprising and the immediate surrender of the military, had instead unleashed the Thousand Cuts doctrine. This decentralized strategy allowed local commanders across the Middle East to act independently, launching waves of attacks that did not require authorization from a central command that no longer existed. The panic in the White House was exacerbated by the deafening silence from the presidential living quarters. While the official line remained that the president was merely suffering from exhaustion, the lack of any video evidence or live audio addresses was fueling a global narrative of American vulnerability. Behind closed doors, the discussions had shifted from military targets to the constitutional mechanics of the 25th Amendment. Cabinet members were reportedly whispering about the stability of the executive branch, even as the Joint Chiefs of Staff struggled to coordinate a response to the escalating violence in the Persian Gulf. This power vacuum was the exact scenario the Iranian regime had prepared for, and they were exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. Cyber warfare units based in clandestine facilities across the Iranian plateau began targeting the American financial sector, causing widespread disruptions in digital payment systems and sparking a wave of bank runs across major metropolitan areas. On the ground in the Middle East, the situation had deteriorated into a nightmare of epic proportions. Hezbollah, acting in coordination with remaining elements of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, launched an estimated 10,000 rockets and precision missiles toward northern and central Israel. The Iron Dome and David's Sling defense systems were pushed to their absolute breaking point, with several projectiles managing to impact populated areas in Tel Aviv and Haifa. The human cost was mounting by the hour, yet the American response remained hampered by the internal chaos in Washington. The fatal crash of the administration's strategy was now visible to every world leader, as allies in Europe and Asia began to distance themselves from the conflict, fearing that the lack of clear leadership in the United States would lead to an uncontrolled nuclear escalation. The world's primary superpower appeared to be drifting, a massive ship of state without a pilot at the helm during the most dangerous storm of the century. The economic fallout was equally devastating, as global markets reacted to the total blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices had breached $180 per barrel, and shipping insurance rates for the region had become so astronomical that commercial traffic had virtually ceased. This was the total panic the White House had feared most, not just a military defeat, but a global economic depression triggered by a war that was supposed to be over in 48 hours. In the Situation Room, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the palpable fear of men and women who realized they had gambled the stability of the world on a single, high-stakes operation. The health alert regarding the president was no longer a private medical matter. It was a national security threat that was being monitored by every intelligence agency on Earth, from Moscow to Beijing, as they waited to see if the American giant would stumble and fall under the weight of its own internal crisis. The tactical success of the decapitation strike against the supreme leader was rapidly proving to be a hollow victory as the strategic landscape shifted in a way that Washington had never anticipated. The strike had not led to the expected paralysis of the Iranian military machine. Instead, it triggered a pre-programmed, automated response that the White House was now desperately trying to understand. This was the ultimate realization of the fatal crash, not just a medical emergency for the president, but the complete disintegration of the assumptions that had underpinned American foreign policy for years. The belief that Iran was a fragile entity, ready to shatter at the first sign of pressure, was proving to be a catastrophic miscalculation. As the hours passed, the reports from the intelligence agencies became increasingly dire. The Iranian response was not a series of random attacks, but a coordinated effort to dismantle the economic and security architecture of the entire Middle East. Within the White House, the total panic was becoming visible to even the most junior staff members. The health alert regarding the president had reached a critical stage, and the lack of a clear line of succession in this specific crisis was causing a breakdown in the decision-making process. The vice president, while theoretically in command, was facing significant pushback from various factions within the cabinet who were unsure of the president's actual status. This internal power struggle was happening while thousands of American troops were in the direct line of fire across the region. The fatal crash of leadership was creating a vacuum that was being filled by fear and indecision. Every move the United States made seemed to be one step behind the rapidly evolving reality on the ground. The Iranian military, using their decentralized command structure, was launching attacks that were both unpredictable and devastatingly effective. The global community was watching this unfolding disaster with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Traditional allies, who had long looked to the United States for stability, were now questioning the fundamental competence of the administration. In the halls of the United Nations, the calls for an immediate ceasefire were being ignored by both sides, as the conflict had moved beyond the point where diplomacy could easily intervene. The economic impact was being felt in every corner of the globe. From the stock exchanges of Tokyo and London to the small businesses in the American heartland, the fear of a prolonged and widening war was causing a massive flight to safety. This was the real-world consequence of the total panic in Washington, a world that was losing its anchor and drifting into uncharted and dangerous waters. The Iranian retaliation had now expanded to include the targeting of international shipping lanes far beyond the Persian Gulf. Using their long-range drone technology, they were beginning to disrupt trade in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. This was a clear message to the world. No one was safe as long as the conflict continued. The White House was now faced with an impossible choice. They could either escalate the conflict further, or they could attempt a humiliating withdrawal that would signal the end of American dominance in the region. The health of the president remained the most significant variable in this equation. Without his direct and clear leadership, the administration was like a ship in a storm without a rudder. The fatal crash of the president's health had become the fatal crash of an era of American power, and the world was beginning to contemplate a future that no one had truly prepared for. The atmosphere in the subterranean bunkers beneath the White House has reached a point of absolute, suffocating tension. What began as a bold, strategic strike has devolved into what historians may one day call the fatal crash of the American century. Rumors of the president's incapacitation have leaked beyond the inner circle, sparking a constitutional crisis that is paralyzing the nation's ability to respond to the flames engulfing the Middle East. Inside the medical suite, the most powerful man in the world is reportedly surrounded by a team of elite specialists, while outside the door, the Vice President and the Secretary of State are locked in a quiet but fierce battle over the implementation of the 25th Amendment. This is the total panic that the Iranian regime had gambled on a superpower decapitated not by a missile, but by the sheer, crushing weight of its own internal pressures and the health of its leader. Meanwhile, the Iranian retaliation has entered its most lethal phase yet. The Islamic Republic has officially declared the start of Operation Martyr's Revenge, launching a synchronized barrage of over 800 precision-guided missiles and thousands of suicide drones against every major United States military installation within a 2,000-mile radius. The air defense systems at Al Udeid in Qatar and the naval base in Bahrain are being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the assault. For the first time in decades, American soil, specifically the territory of Guam and Hawaii, is being placed on high alert as intelligence reports suggest the movement of Iranian long-range assets. The fatal crash of the American deterrent is now a reality that commanders on the ground are forced to face without clear guidance from Washington. Every minute of indecision in the White House results in more casualties and more devastation across the global security landscape. The global economy, once the bedrock of American influence, is now in a state of terminal velocity. With the Strait of Hormuz closed and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait under constant fire from Houthi rebels, the world's energy heart has stopped beating. Oil has surged past $200 a barrel, and the ripple effects are destroying the purchasing power of millions of families across the United States. Food prices are skyrocketing, and the logistics chains that sustain modern life are snapping under the strain of war. In the streets of major American cities, the initial patriotic fervor has been replaced by a growing sense of dread and civil unrest. People are demanding to see their president, to hear a voice of authority, but they are met only with recycled press releases and vague updates. This total panic is not confined to the halls of power. It has permeated the very soul of the nation as the realization sets in that the fatal crash is not just a headline, but a lived reality. In the darkened corridors of the Kremlin and the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, the scenes from Washington are being analyzed with cold, predatory interest. The perceived weakness of the American executive is being viewed as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reshape the world order. Russia has begun moving its tactical nuclear assets closer to the borders of Eastern Europe, while China has increased its naval activity in the South China Sea to unprecedented levels. They are watching the fatal crash of the American administration and preparing to fill the void. The White House, consumed by its own internal health alert and the panic of its leadership, is unable to effectively project power on multiple fronts. The strategy of a quick win in Iran has backfired so spectacularly that it has left the entire Western alliance system exposed and vulnerable to a catastrophic collapse. As the clock ticks toward the next wave of Iranian strikes, the medical specialists are forced to make a decision that will define the future of the Republic. The health alert has reached a point where it can no longer be hidden from the public or the military. The fatal crash of the president's physical capacity is now inextricably linked to the fatal crash of the war effort. Commanders in the field, tired of waiting for orders that never come, are beginning to take matters into their own hands, raising the terrifying prospect of an unauthorized nuclear escalation. The total panic in the White House has reached its zenith, as the administration realizes that they are no longer in control of the monster they have unleashed. The world stands on the precipice of a darkness that no one, not even the most brilliant strategists in Washington, knows how to navigate. The final hour of the crisis arrived not with a roar, but with a chilling, televised silence that gripped the entire world. In the early hours of the morning, the White House press corps was summoned to the briefing room under conditions of absolute secrecy. The air was heavy with the realization that the fatal crash of the administration's strategy and the health of the president had reached a point of no return. As the cameras flickered to life, the vice president stepped to the podium, looking visibly shaken, to announce the formal invocation of the 25th Amendment. For the first time in American history, the transfer of power was occurring not during an inauguration, but in the middle of a catastrophic regional war and a global economic meltdown. This was the total panic that the world had sensed the confirmation that the leader of the free world was no longer capable of steering the ship of state through the storm he had helped create. Across the ocean, the Iranian plateau remained a landscape of smoldering ruins and defiant rage. The death of the supreme leader had not brought the promised democracy. Instead, it had cleared the way for the most radical elements of the Revolutionary Guard to take absolute control. With no central authority left to negotiate with, the conflict had entered a state of perpetual, decentralized violence. The Mosaic defense had succeeded in making the country ungovernable for any foreign power. Reports began to emerge of rogue military units within Iran, moving chemical and biological assets toward the coast, a final, desperate deterrent against a full-scale ground invasion. The United States, now under a transitional leadership, found itself trapped in a geopolitical quagmire that dwarfed the failures of Vietnam and Iraq combined. The fatal crash was complete, a military victory that had resulted in a strategic and moral defeat of unprecedented proportions. The economic devastation was now permanent. The global financial system, built on the assumption of American stability and the free flow of energy, was being rewritten in real time. China and Russia, seizing the moment of American distraction and internal chaos, announced the creation of a new, gold-backed reserve currency, effectively ending the era of the petrodollar. In the United States, the stock market remained shuttered for the third consecutive day as the government struggled to contain the hyperinflation caused by the $250 per barrel oil price. The American public, once divided by politics, was now united in a profound sense of loss and uncertainty. The health alert that had started in the Oval Office had become a systemic illness affecting every household in the nation. This was the final stage of the total panic, the realization that the world order as they knew it had vanished overnight. As the sun rose over a world forever changed, the true cost of the conflict became clear. Thousands of American service members were dead or wounded. The Middle East was a fractured wasteland of warring factions, and the global economy was entering a new dark age. The fatal crash was not just the story of a president's failing health or a military operation gone wrong. It was the story of the limits of power in a multipolar world. The documentary of this era will record that the attempt to solve a decades-old geopolitical rivalry with a single masterstroke was the ultimate hubris. The White House, once the symbol of global leadership, was now a house of mourning for a leader, for a strategy, and for a vision of the world that could no longer be sustained. The era of undisputed American dominance had ended not with a victory parade, but in the shadow of a health alert and a cycle of retaliation that no one knew how to stop. The legacy of these 6 days in February 2026 will haunt the corridors of power for generations. It serves as a grim reminder that in the high-stakes game of global geopolitics, the human element, the health of a leader, the unpredictability of an adversary, and the fragility of the markets is often the most volatile variable of all. The fatal crash of the administration was the final act of a drama that had been building for years, a tragedy that has left the world searching for a new path forward in a landscape defined by fire and uncertainty. As the new administration in Washington begins the agonizing process of de-escalation, they do so in a world that no longer trusts the old rules, a world where the panic has subsided into a cold, hard reality of a new and dangerous century.